all black, everything.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by a very special guest, Beth Hubbard, who is a television, stage, and theater producer. She's also an alum of Duke University, and she is back this weekend for DEMAN Weekend. Talk a little bit about why you're back here and what DEMAN Weekend is.
Well, it's a sort of a congregation gathering of all entertainment alumni. And we're coming in from film studios, from television studios, from production companies, marketing, branding. So it's for us to be able to integrate with the student body and young alums back here to talk about everything from branding, marketing, scripts, how do you get your film made, et cetera.
So you've been involved in some really amazing projects the last couple of years, and stuff that I think is very relevant to the Left to Black audience. The first one being the film The Rape of Recy Taylor, also the one-man stage show, Turn Me Loose, which looks at the life of Dick Gregory, and you're currently working on a project on Arthur Ashe. Let's start with the Recy Taylor story. How did you get connected with that project?
So there is a book called At the Dark End of the Street.
Daniel McGuire, right, who's former guest on Left to Black.
Oh, see, there you go. So I was looking for a project to do with Nancy Bursky, who from The Loving Story, she wrote and directed The Loving Story.
Right,
the
she's connected also through...
she created Full Frame.
Yeah.
So she sent me that book. Somebody gave it to her, and she sent it to me, and she said, we have to go shoot this woman. Look at the first 3 chapters, and it's really, the whole book is about, as you know, about the fact that a black woman has never been able to really own her own body, period.
And Miss Taylor was still alive at the time?
Yes, she was. And so a month later, we find ourselves in Abbeville, Alabama, shooting Recy Taylor, who was raped by 7 white men, young men from 16 to 21 in 1945. And they were, of course, never convicted by any of the white grand juries that were, in existence back then. So we felt this was a really important story to tell because her entire life, she never stopped talking about what happened to her, even though she was physically threatened.
Right.
So, of course, I fell deeply in love with the story because here's a woman who could have spent her entire life being angry and upset and a giant chip on her shoulder, and instead, because of her faith, she was able to move on with her life, and her life was not an easy one.
Right.
But the fact is that it was, she triumphed over something really horrific that happened to her, and she was a real example of something that happened consistently and is still happening to African American women. And so when Nancy said, we've got to go down there, we went right down there and got her, and it was the last interview that she ever did. She died last year, 2-3 days before Christmas. Yeah.
And one of the reasons why her story also resonates is that it's really the entry point for the career of Rosa Parks as an activist.
That's correct.
Right, she goes down and she investigates the case, and many folks think about Rosa Parks initially becoming active around the Montgomery bus boycott, but Recy Taylor's story actually tells us that this is something that was part of her DNA, if you will.
She was very influenced, Rosa Parks, by her grandfather, who was a big Marcus Garvey follower.
Right.
And she was actually very militant growing up. In fact, there's a very famous story about how her husband approached her, but because he was light-skinned, she was not going to really deal with him. He was a barber. And then she found out that he was actually an activist, and they ended up getting married. But she was that kind of woman, and it really, Recy's, she was very careful about the way she approached the Recy Taylor, in specific that particular case. She was secretary of the NAACP at the time in Montgomery, which was actually in history, it's the strongest chapter of the NAACP in its history. And she knew that the NAACP didn't necessarily want to go on record as helping sexual assault victims at the time for a number of reasons. And she was obviously going around and interviewing people about the lynchings, et cetera. She was very active. And remember now, as the secretary of the NAACP, she held the membership list, which was one of the most dangerous positions because of that, because the KKK and all the...
You could get access to it, right?
And if they did...
Right, folks would be
right.
endangered.
So
right?
she had to be very careful about the way she handled something like the Recy Taylor case. But she came down twice. She was thrown out the second time by the sheriff, out of Recy's house physically, and told never to come back, and followed to the state line. So it was dangerous.
Yeah.
But it was amazing work. And the film really debunks the whole, this theory that she started because she was tired one day on a bus.
Right, on a bus, right.
Yeah, so you're right.
The film also resonates now, obviously, for folks because of the Me Too moment.
Yeah.
How has it been traveling around the country with the film and engaging, particularly younger audiences?
I think it's been fascinating. I will tell you that as a white woman, one of the first things that I say, having produced this and other African American content, I am very, very aware that I am not black.
Yeah.
And by the way, I have 2 African American children that remind me of that every day. But I say all that to say that, Nancy and I are very, very aware that, we're 2 white women talking about a very personal subject to black women. But we both say that it would have been complicit in racism and the racism of our race to not do this story. Yeah. And we felt an obligation and responsibility to do it. And that having been said, we have found profound depth in our audiences in their response to this. Many have had intergenerational rape in their family that has never been talked about. Right. Except anecdotally, and they stand up. And we had one woman, for instance, in Montgomery who was, I would say, about 65, 70 years old, light-skinned woman. And she stood up, and she was part of the school board for Montgomery, Alabama, and she stood up and she said to me and Robert, Recy's brother, "How do you think I got here?" And the whole audience stopped. Yeah. So it's extremely relevant, and it's been very powerful. And I think what we've tried to do is use it as a conversation starter for people to understand and be aware. Many white folks they're not aware at how this is still very prevalent and affecting, great-grandchildren today.
Yeah. You're also involved with a project on Dick Gregory.
Yeah.
Turn Me Loose. It was launched in New York 2 years ago with Joe Morton. It's been in LA. It's been recently a run in Washington, D.C. How did you get connected to Dick Gregory?
So, I met Dick with my mother when I was 6 years old. Wow. And he stood out to me because he was the only guy in a very sort of, I want to say, basically 3/4 white cocktail party. And he came over to me, and he had a drink and a cigarette in his hand. And he leaned down and he said, "Are you having anything?" And I thought, who is this guy? I fell in love with him then. And my brother and I used to listen to his albums along with Richard Pryor, who was obviously very influenced by Dick. So that was way back. So one of the producers and the director came to me and said, once again, I'm a white director, right. I'm a white producer. We would like someone who, is African American that can get involved with us and make sure that we're presenting this the right way. And Dick was already involved, and he was approving every draft, but they also needed some star power, really. So they came to me and they said, "Let's go to Lawrence Fishburne, let's go to Sam Jackson." And I said, those are great ideas and amazing people. I have somebody I'd like you to think about, and it's John Legend. I said, I think he's going to win an Oscar this year. I think he's going to win.
Selma, right?
Yep. And I said, I think he's going to win a Golden Globe, and I think you're going to find he's a real humanitarian. Yeah. And I had been working with John Legend and his company and Mike Jackson and Get Lifted for about 5 years on another project. And I just find him an incredibly deeply committed individual to what he gets involved with. And so we brought John on. I came on as a producer, and that started the relationship. And knowing Dick was one of the true blessings of my life. I mean, I don't know that I've ever met anyone more dedicated to service than Dick Gregory, to the point where it actually almost hurt him in many ways, physically, financially. it didn't matter. And he knew he was taken care of. And that's part of the message of Turn Me Loose is we are all taken care of. Everything we need is right here. But what are we going to do about it? Are we going to connect with it? Are we going to persevere? Are we going to open up to that strength that we have? Or are we going to just complain and be victimized?
Yeah. You know, Joe Morton's a great actor. You know, folks who knew him from The Brother from Another Planet,
One of my favorite
or
movies.
might remember him as Senator Byron from A Different World. But by the time he shows up, you know, doing Turn Me Loose, most folks know him now as Papa Pope. How was it to have someone, you know, who had been obviously a incredible veteran actor for so long, who suddenly has this moment where he blows up? And then he's now attached, you know, to this great story.
It was great. I will tell you, we met with Joe at the Soho House, and there was John Legend and Joe Morton and the director, and Jackie Judd, the producer, and the director is John Gould Rubin. And Brother from Another Planet is actually one of my favorite films of all time, and I'd watched it quite a bit as a little girl, and I was just in awe. So to me, that's who he was. He was from the John Sayles movie. But I also watched Scandal, and I got what everybody loves about him. It was incredible. You know, he came to the table and he said, you know, I have an issue with the N-word. But after reading the script and watching everything online about Dick Gregory, I get it. I get what he's saying, and I'm willing to buy into it. And what happened was this man became Dick Gregory in many ways. And, you know, that's the beauty of an actor like Joe. I mean, he's profoundly talented. But on top of that, he agreed with most of what Dick was saying and understood that Dick was, you know, prophetic in so many different ways. And so he was in awe of playing this role. Yeah. And on opening night, it was very funny because, you know, Dick's sitting in the audience.
He's still alive, right? He's still
alive.
There. Yeah.
He's, you know, we're at the West Side Theater, the curtain goes up, and he's on the third row. And Joe was, you know, he said, I was affected by that. And Dick turned to his wife during the production and said, you know, how do you think about it? He said, shut up, I'm watching my husband on stage. So, what are you going to say? That's what Joe does.
You will appreciate this question, at least the spirit of the question. Are we still at a moment in 2018, whether we're talking about television, film, or stage, where you really do have to have white producers to be able to tell the stories of African Americans? Or do you think there's been some sort of shift?
I think there's been a shift, but I don't think it's enough. And I am constantly perplexed at my race and the way that they tout themselves with and decide to tell these stories and take credit for it. It's not appropriate, and I could do a whole podcast on that. I will say to you that what has come to be is that Tyler Perry, whether you like him or not, you know, there are individuals, Spike Lee, whether you like him or not, they have proven that you can make money off of this. And I hate to say this, but it is a product. That is the way people look at it that are spending the money to make this stuff happen and distributing it. But I was in an argument the other day about this. I said, you know, it's interesting because I find that even with all of the success around Shonda Rhimes and Tyler Perry and Black Panther, it's still designated as its own genre, which is upsetting because the fact is that it's entertainment. That's what it is. So we have a long way to go, and you know, I'm lucky enough to be involved in this stuff. The product leads, I don't lead it. Yeah. So, you know, I'd have to tell you that I think there is, unfortunately, you know, Hollywood, like the tech industry and other industries, it's run by white men, period. And I think that's changing, but we have to work harder, you know, to change it.
Not to get into too many trade secrets, are there stories that you want to tell that you haven't told yet?
Yes. For sure. Yeah. you know, there's a story I'm working on now, which is the story of it's a true story of a Puerto Rican American young teenage young man who was in Florida and became homeless. He was a baseball star at a high school. His mother lost her house and had to go back to Puerto Rico. And he literally spends a year by himself and becomes homeless. Nobody at the high school knew it. He goes to a pastor of a friend who says, basically, I only know one place you can stay. And he opens the door of the motel, and it's Michael Keaton. And Michael Keaton plays a recovering drug addict who takes him in, and they weather Hurricane Maria together.
Wow.
And as his mother's house collapses in Puerto Rico, and he becomes a metaphor for Puerto Rico, and as Puerto Rico is to America. Right. And it's a fascinating story of laughter, includes laughter and joy, but it's of redemption because he ends up, against all odds, graduating from high school. And so I want to tell stories that not only can affect folks, right, but also that have a life after you walk out of the film. And we've brought the Raven Group on, which is an amazing marketing group out of Washington, D.C., who lobbies and has helped raise $35 million for Puerto Rico. We want to create a whole program with Puerto Rico and having Puerto Rican kids come into the crew. And, you know, that's the kind of film I want to be involved in. And then there's couple of others that I have, but that'll all bubble up soon. So,
we've been joined today by Beth Hubbard, Duke alum, producer of stage, film, and television. Thank you, Beth, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Beth.
All right, bless you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.